Good morning, econ students, and welcome back once again for a little bit of AP macroeconomics. Today's lesson is going to cover two more graphs that we should know. Keep in mind, this is in prep for the 2020 exam, and we've been told that on this year's exam, the FRQs will not involve students actually getting any credit for drawing graphs. Your answers might be numbers, they might be explanations. You might say something like interest rates go up, interest rates go down, but you will not actually draw these graphs. However, it said that we might need to know these graphs in order to know what's happening in the economy and to be able to explain why it's happening. So we're doing a couple of graphs today that deal with interest rates, and these are relevant partly because we've just been doing money multipliers and T-charts and monetary policy. And so these are graphs that would go along with those kinds of topics. So two new graphs today. The first graph is going to be the money market graph. The money market graph is actually a graph that is just about the supply and demand of money. So if you know your supply and demand graph, you basically already know this stuff, but we're going to do the supply and demand of money. So on the horizontal, let's put in our quantity of money. On the vertical, we're going to put in the price of money, but the price of money is really like what you pay to borrow money, or it's the opportunity cost of holding money. And so the price for money is actually the nominal interest rate. I think when I learned this in college, we just had generically that it was the interest rate, but on the AP curriculum, it definitely says nominal interest rate. If anyone wants to explain why it's nominal and not just interest rates in general, let me know. Our demand curve is going to look like a traditional demand curve, sloping down and to the right, basically with the idea that if interest rates are low, people will be happy to take out more money. If interest rates are high, people will demand less money. Our supply curve, though, is going to look totally different from our traditional supply and demand curve. Well, not totally different, but our supply curve is just going to be a vertical line. And the vertical line is wherever the Federal Reserve wants to put it. The Federal Reserve is not really producing money because of market pressure. It's not like they're a business producing a product for customers. The Federal Reserve is a government agency that is designed to regulate the economy. And so the Federal Reserve gets to put the money supply wherever they want it to be. And so if they want to stick the money supply here, they can. If they want to stick it over here, they could. If they want to stick it to the left, they could. And when we look at monetary policy will move the supply of money to the left or to the right. If we were drawing this in nicely, we could put in an equilibrium. We'll label the equilibrium R. That's a messy R, but that's an R. I'll put in R sub E. We use R for interest rates because that is the rental rate for money. And then we could put in like a Q sub E. Sorry for the mess. Let's say that in today's quick sample problem, if the Federal Reserve wanted to increase the money supply, if they increase the money supply, then we're just going to put in a new supply curve to the right of the original supply curve. We can see on the graph what happens to interest rates. And so we know that if the Federal Reserve increases the supply of money, we will end up with lower interest rates and a higher quantity of money in circulation. And all of that should match what you already know from banking T-charts in the last video. Of course, the opposite would be true if we want to do a supply shift to the left with contractionary monetary policy. That would give us higher interest rates and a lower quantity of money in circulation. We're going to do one more graph here, which is really similar. It's so similar that I know in past years when kids were drawing these graphs on an FRQ, they usually mixed them up. Here we're going to do quantity, not of money, we're going to do quantity of loanable funds. Loanable funds is just econo speak for money that is available for loans, money that is available for borrowing. On our vertical, in this case, I think I learned this as just generic interest rates, but on the AP curriculum, it is the real interest rate. is your cost of borrowing money. Why we've got real on one and nominal on the other, I've never quite understood, but that's the way they've always drawn this in our curriculum. Somebody wants to explain that to me. I'm all ears. Anyway, our supply and demand are going to be traditional supply and demand curves, with demand sloping down to the right and supply sloping up and to the right. Again, basically, this is about people responding to incentives. If interest rates are low, people will demand a lot of loans. People will take out loans to buy something. Businesses will take out loans to do research and development. The government will take out loans to build infrastructure. If interest rates are high, there will be a lower demand for those loans. Meanwhile, the supply of loanable funds comes from a lot of different places. It comes partly from banks, but really it comes largely from our savings. And so if interest rates are high, you and I will probably put more money in the bank, and banks then have more to lend out. So at a high interest rate, the supply of loanable funds will be high as well. And if it's a low interest rate, then you and I won't save as much money because it's not worth it. We won't be making much money with our money. And at that point, the supply is low, but the demand would be high. More people would be willing to take out loans at a low interest rate. If we're looking at the loanable funds graph, we're going to see some similarities to our money market graph, in that if the Federal Reserve increases the money supply here, we're going to see a supply shift to the right here. Easy enough. And so in this case, we had maybe our first equilibrium. If the Federal Reserve increases the money supply, then we end up with a lower nominal interest rate on the money market graph, and we end up with a lower real interest rate on the loanable funds graph. Loanable funds does have other things besides the Federal Reserve. If we're looking at our money market graph, that supply is just wherever the Federal Reserve wants to put it. We could see other shifts here that come down to like people responding to incentives. As we enter a recession, for example, people are more likely to save their money instead of spend their money. And so as we enter a recession, we could say that we'll see an increase in the supply of loanable funds. As we enter a recession, we should see a decrease in the demand for loanable funds as people will be afraid to borrow money. The demand curve for loanable funds is all about, our willingness to borrow, businesses' willingness to borrow, and also the government's willingness to borrow. So demand can shift to the left or right depending on really how we feel about the future and whether or not we want to borrow money. But anyway, something like the Federal Reserve would increase the supply of money, and it would also increase the supply of loanable funds. And as that happens, we'll see real interest rates and nominal interest rates both dropping. Let's just connect this to one final graph, and we'll call it a day. In this sample problem, we're looking at an increase in the supply of money, an increase in the supply of loanable funds, and that is going to affect our aggregate supply and demand graph. So let's review aggregate supply and demand real quick. On the horizontal, we're going to put in our real GDP. On the vertical, we put in the price level. We've got an upward sloping short run aggregate supply curve. We have a downward sloping aggregate demand curve. And if we were at equilibrium, a long run equilibrium, then we would have a vertical LRAS going through the intersection of the other two. We use Y sub F here to say real GDP at the full employment level of output, and maybe like a P sub E. If interest rates are low, here's where we're going to finish this off. If interest rates are low, if nominal interest rates are low, if real interest rates have dropped, if we're looking at a supply of money increasing or a supply of loanable funds increasing, then when we look at the aggregate supply and demand graph, we should see this mostly as an aggregate demand shift. If interest rates are low, you and I will take advantage of low interest rates and we will borrow money to buy a new car or to run up our credit card debt, or businesses will take out money to increase their capabilities, or maybe at that point even governments borrow more money for their projects. And so those components of real GDP, C plus G plus I, I'm not worried about the NX right now, but those components, which are real GDP, those components also affect aggregate demand. And if we see low interest rates, we would see increased consumption, increased business investment, and maybe increased government spending, perhaps, as they respond to lower interest rates. And so if we increase the money supply, if we increase the supply of loanable funds, then we'll see an increase in aggregate demand and an economy that expands. That's it. If we want to do this whole problem again, we could do it with a contraction in the money supply. That would give us a lower supply of loanable funds. That would give us higher interest rates. And that would explain our aggregate demand shift to the left if we want to slow down an economy. I think that's good for today. We have one more graph to learn, and that would be our Phillips curve graph. So tune in next time for the Phillips curve.